there's no question that states in Eastern Europe that were outside NATO wanted in. I don't blame Ukraine for wanting in. My point is we don't have to accept them. There's no rule that says just because somebody wants to be in NATO that we have an open door policy and we take them in.
And you didn't with Ukraine.
I actually don't believe that at all. We have actually doubled down.
They are not members of Ukraine, and no one has...
You have to let me answer the questions.
Yes.
Because,
sorry.
You raised a lot of excellent points, and I want to deal with them. But I think that if it's clear that the Russians view Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you should not admit Ukraine to NATO or push to admit Ukraine to NATO, because the end result is what you have today. We, in effect, pursued a policy that is leading to the destruction of Ukraine. If we had not attempted to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border, with NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolution, but especially NATO expansion, there'd be, in all likelihood, no war in Ukraine today. Crimea would still be part of Ukraine, and certainly those 4 oblasts that the Russians annexed would be part of Ukraine. But I just want to go back to a couple points that Carl raised. First of all, I've gone over in great detail every one of Putin's speeches, press conferences, and his writings. And the argument that he was bent on incorporating Ukraine into Russia is usually said to be outlined in a famous article that he wrote on July 12th, 2021. You can easily find this article on the internet. And he did say many of the things that Carl said about how it was regrettable, how Lenin set up the Soviet Union, and so forth and so on. He does not say in that paper that he is interested in conquering Ukraine, that it's desirable to conquer Ukraine, or that's what he intends to do. In fact, if you go look at the article, and this is the article that almost everybody points to, you should go read it. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian independence, and he says that the future of Ukraine is up to the Ukrainian people. That's what he says in the article that everybody points to is the key piece of evidence that he was out to conquer Ukraine. As I said to you before, I can find no evidence that he thought he could conquer Ukraine. Just a word or two about capabilities. He had 190,000 troops. It was almost all of his army, as Carl pointed out. You're not going to conquer a piece of real estate as large as Ukraine with an army that small. And he might have dropped bombs on Western Ukraine, but you can't conquer and occupy a country with bombs. You need ground forces to do that. He didn't have the ground forces. He never even attempted to conquer 1/2 of the country. At most, he attempted to conquer 1/3 of the country. He just didn't have the capability. This was not the Wehrmacht. Even with regard to Kyiv, he could not have conquered Kyiv with the forces that he had. It was just too small an army. He wanted to threaten Kyiv, but he couldn't conquer it. Now, just one final point, and then I'll turn it back to you, Cecilia. Carl said that if you look at what happened over the past few decades, it's a case of the East moving West and not the West moving East. I don't know how you could make that argument with NATO expansion. Of course it's the West moving East. NATO expansion, EU expansion, the color revolutions. Where were the Russians moving westward? The Russians weren't capable of launching a military offensive in the 1990s. They were so weak, and then Putin comes to power in 2000, and over time he resurrects the Russians. He brings them back from the dead, but they don't have the military capability to go on the offensive. As you know, in the August 2008 military campaign in Georgia, the Russian army performed terribly. Right? They just don't have the military capability. There's no evidence that the East is moving west. It's the West that's moving east. And this is what presents an existential threat to the Russians.
But what about if you go back to 2007? That is when Putin, in his speech in Munich, announced that in his view, the multipolar world was already arriving. Now, in your presentation, you said 2017. That is 10 years later. So isn't it a possibility that Putin, from that moment on, has that in mind as he goes forward from 2008 and then interprets things
No, the
differently?
the famous Munich speech in 2007 that Cecilia is referencing is where Putin first makes it manifestly clear that he is angry at the West for their policies, which he thinks do not take into account Russian interests. But he does not indicate that he's going to rectify this problem by going on the offensive and attacking any country in the world. What sets off the real trouble is the April 2008 decision at Bucharest. This is the NATO summit at Bucharest, April 2008, where NATO says at the end of that summit that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August 2008, you had a war in Georgia, and then starting on February 22nd, 2014, conflict broke out in Ukraine, right? That's what was driving the train here. And by the way, just one final point before I turn it to Carl. Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy were adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO at the April 2008 Bucharest summit. And Angela Merkel has recently said that the reason she opposed bringing Ukraine into NATO is that she understood, listen to these words, she understood that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war against Russia. That's in April 2008. But what did the Americans do? The Americans steamrolled her, and they steamrolled Sarkozy. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it all blew up in their face on February 24th of this year.
Your reaction to this, Phil?
Pure fantasy. I can agree with you, John, that sort of the Bucharest meeting was fairly muddled. There were the then president of Ukraine, the then president of Georgia who wanted in, and most people said no. And then as a compromise they had that particular language. But they refused them even a membership action plan. And you need unanimity in NATO. And since then, there's not been a single NATO meeting where there's been a serious discussion about membership. And even, I would say, even a half-dead second secretary of a Russian embassy in any NATO country would be able to report back that that was off the table for the foreseeable future. Off the table for the foreseeable future. What caused the big problem in 2013 and 2014, and I was there, was the fact that Ukraine wanted to have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And it was the Ukrainians who wanted it. They were knocking on the EU door time after time after time. Not everyone in the EU was enthusiastic, but evidently that was given. And then Putin said, this is utterly unacceptable. Forced President Yanukovych with the most brutal means to go back on that. That caused the people of Ukraine to go to the square in Maidan waving, they didn't wave American flags, sorry to say. They waved the EU flags on the Maidan and say, we want to be part of this. And why? Not because they were anti-Russian. That was not an issue at the moment. They saw the success of Poland, for example, having done the democratic reforms and having done the economic reforms and having a substantially better economic and social and political development than Ukraine had. No question, they wanted to go the same way. And Ukraine happens, and that's fairly important to understand, Ukraine is a democracy. They have elections. They express their will to go, in this particular case, west. on going west and east is not moving geography. I agree with that. Geography doesn't move. But in political terms, they wanted to go west. Poland wanted to go west into NATO. Ukraine wanted to go west into the EU, as the Baltic states did. They wanted to go away from the east, which they associated with authoritarian and failed and repressive regimes in Russia. And that, I think, and there I can agree with you, I think Putin does see that as an existential threat. I think he does see a successful, democratic, big Ukraine as an existential threat, not to Russia, but to the sort of Russian regime that he represents. And he's been abundantly clear in saying that what is called colored revolutions, people waving European flags, people waving flags of others, people wanted democracy, people wanted to be able to elect their governments. He's been abundantly clear that he sees that as an existential threat to his Russian regime. In that particular sense, he's right.
Let me make two sets of responses to what Carl said. He makes the argument, which many people make, that there was really no chance that Ukraine would become part of NATO, and that we have sort of given up on that. I believe that's simply not true. And in June of 2021, NATO's conference was held at Brussels. In an official statement released by NATO, they said that they were reinvigorating their commitment to bring Ukraine into NATO. On November 10th, 2021, the United States and Ukraine issued a white paper laying out the strategic relationship between the United States and Ukraine, where we made it unequivocally clear we were committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Furthermore, we were arming and training the Ukrainians so that they were effectively becoming a de facto member of NATO. Many people wonder why the Ukrainians have done so well against the Russians on the battlefield. And they say it's because the Russians are incompetent, period, end of story. That's half of the story. The other half is that the Ukrainians were a formidable fighting force. And they were a formidable fighting force because we were training 10,000 Ukrainian troops per year from 2014 to 2024. And we were arming the Ukrainians. President Zelensky and his defense minister today refer to Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, in fact, and then in principle, we remain committed to bringing it into the alliance. Now, okay, go ahead. No, let me make one quick point just on another issue that Carl raised. Carl raised the point that the Russians viewed Ukraine becoming a liberal democracy as a serious threat, and you said you agreed with me on that. The point I want to make is that NATO, mainly the United States, was pursuing a three-pronged strategy. I tried to make that clear in my formal presentation. NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a liberal democracy. So it's important to understand that that third strand that Carl was talking about, where he and I agree, that third strand is inextricably linked to the second strand and the first strand in the minds of the Russians. So when he... Go ahead.
Now, in the minds of Putin, don't say that Putin and the Russians are necessarily the same things. I've been involved with Russia intensely since the early 90s. I made a lot of friends. I worked very closely together with two Russian foreign ministers I still consider my friends, and one of them I'm still in contact with. And in the Balkans, we work constructively with them. I have to say that all of my friends from those years are either dead, killed, murdered, in prison, or outside of Russia. But those were Russians that wanted the same thing as the Ukrainians. They wanted constitutional government in their country. They wanted sort of decent living standards. They wanted free speech. They wanted some sort of democracy, might not have been Swedish standards. But Putin has a security regime that is different. And he has faced demonstrations in Russia that he fights with violence after he returned to power, and he's seen colored revolutions as a threat against his regime. That's why I'm saying, in that particular aspect, he's right. He considers the colored revolutions, democracy in other parts of the former Soviet Union, as a threat to his regime. But that, to be precise, is not something that invented by me or by American politicians. That is demands coming from the people in these countries themselves. Democracy, it's called.
Can I?
But Paul, let me, can I just quick go back?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to, I hope you don't mind us going
That's
back and
good.
forth, but
Okay.
I mean, this
Go ahead.
fits together
Go ahead.
neatly. I think that if you talk about Russian elites regarding the issue that we're talking about tonight, the question is, how do the Russian elites think about bringing Ukraine into NATO? And you might think from listening to Carl talk that there's disagreement among the Russian elites. I do not believe that's the case. And Bill Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, he's now the head of the CIA, and he was the US ambassador to Moscow at the time of the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008, wrote a famous memo to Condoleezza Rice, where he said, for the entire Russian elite, not just Putin, Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines. He said, I've talked to all of the knuckle draggers in the depths of the Kremlin. And he said, I've talked to Putin's most ardent liberal critics, and they all agree to a person that Ukraine in NATO is unacceptable. So on that particular issue, which is the issue on the table this evening, there is unanimity. This is why, Carl, I would say that, you know, if Putin is overthrown, you're not going to get somebody in there who is interested in cutting a deal and living with Ukraine and NATO. You'll get somebody who's probably more hawkish than Ukraine, or at least as hawkish.
But where is the Ukrainian people in your analysis? Because the Ukrainian population in 2014 was divided on the issue. But as a result of what has happened in Ukraine over the past 8 years, more and more Ukrainians, also Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are kind of rallying around Kiev. And from February of this year, when the invasion took place, a number of powerful Ukrainians who have been more likely to support Moscow rallied around the flag. How do you explain that?
Well, anytime a foreign country invades your country, you're going to have a rally around the flag effect. Nationalism is going to kick in big time. I think there's no question that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has fueled Ukrainian nationalism, and it has brought the Ukrainian people together. I wouldn't deny that for 1 second.
But didn't Putin take that into account?
Yes, I'm sure he did.
How?
Look, Putin felt for certain that he was in a desperate situation. I mean, invading Ukraine is a matter of huge consequence. You just don't do that lightly. You have to feel that there is a serious security threat, because you might not know to what extent the United States and its European allies are going to come into the fight, but you know the United States is likely to come into the fight. You know how powerful the United States is. Putin was fully aware, you can document this, that the Ukrainians were being armed and trained by the West and were reasonably formidable. So for him to do that, he had to be desperate. This is my point about using nuclear weapons. You do not want to underestimate the risks that great powers are willing to take when they are desperate. And I believe that his attack against Ukraine on February 24th was an act of desperation. It was not an attempt to create a Russian empire.
Because in an interview in the New Yorker in February, you said that in your view, Putin was not going to try to build a greater Russia. He was not interested in conquering and integrating Ukraine into Russia. You suggested that we invented the story that Putin is aggressive and responsible for the situation. Now then, in November, you said, Putin's goals have escalated since the war started on February 24th, and he is now interested in conquering territory by annexing 4 oblasts in the east. Now, most analysts believe the opposite is the case, that Putin's goals were much more ambitious at the outset of the war, but he failed time and time again. The Ukrainian pushback took the Russians by surprise. The closing of ranks in Europe and NATO has been unprecedented since 2001. And how do you explain that a war has gone so badly for Russia has led Putin to escalate his goals?
Look, there's no question that when a war breaks out, and I could walk you through some of the big wars of history, that you get escalation in terms of goals, and you get escalation in terms of the means or the strategies or the weaponry that's used. I mean, you could get nuclear escalation. You get an escalation now where the Russians are attacking the electrical grid in Ukraine. So there has been significant escalation in terms of means, and there has been significant escalation in terms of Russian goals. The question on the table that we've been debating up to now is, what were Russian goals before the war? And as I'm arguing throughout the evening, there is no evidence that the Russians were bent on conquering territory. The Russians went to great lengths to make the Minsk II framework work because the Russians did not want the Donbass. They wanted a Minsk II solution. It's when the Minsk II solution clearly had failed by February of this year that he invaded.